And that's why you see me looking down. I want to hear your questions. I want to see them, but I also want to have a record of them just in case during the course of this discussion, because we know we just go on and on. I can still reference your questions here. So.
And always feel free if you want us to address any specific topic, drop that in, and we may cue that up in terms of having a discussion about that. Also, feel free to drop your emails in the chat. Again, part of doing the work is, doing those meetings, doing, the civic duty. And so, as the ED of DC Young Democrats, please, for us to be able to help you be more active and mobile. If you want to leave your email, I'll get those to the right people, or you can visit the website at dcybs.org. And then also for Gilded Sages, gildedsages.com. And then, am I missing anything? Let's jump into it.
Let's go.
So, we're talking about building community. You sent me some footage and some content the other day that I personally resonated with in terms of not only the stances that he took in terms of the radical. He is in Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
Took those steps. And stances in regard to how he felt about, leftism and it being in the radical space of it, not necessarily also taking in the nuances that are required to have these conversations to really get to where we're building a community and not just responding to certain things. And so with that, I'll just go ahead and let you go ahead and chime in.
No, I was going to ask you, were you referring to the BBC4 interview, or were you referring to the Rogan interview, or both?
I was referring to a combination of them both.
Okay. With Jordan Peterson, being that he is a Canadian professor, I found it interesting how he took that stance. I can't remember the title it was, but he wouldn't use the pronouns that would be mandated by law. And that
he is her, hers, he, she.
Yeah, it's Zer and Zer. It begins with a Z, and this was a while ago. So we're speaking. I think those interviews were
2 years ago.
2 years ago. So this is 2020. We're talking about 2018. That much has changed, especially with the identity politics that we see that's playing out, and that's keeping people from building ideological diversity. We want diversity to be superficial, but when it comes down to ideas and it isn't there. People silo themselves in homogenous groups that they already agree with, so that by the time people come out into open spaces, they're already ramped up. And that's what I think he was talking about with the radical left as well as the radical right. And that's what I love about Jordan Peterson, is that when he presents this argument, it's with a great effort to be balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And not just talking about politics, but also talking about personalities and people in these spaces. And that's one of the things when we get down to the Black American community. I know I honk my horn and I toot too loud sometimes, but that's one of the things I feel is important, is that balance, is seeing that this path may not be the path you're willing to walk, but there's value to someone walking it.
Yeah, and a lot of that is around, we had the conversation around discipline, and again, people having to commit to what it is they say they want, and just to bring in the pop culture aspect of it. Everything right now is happening with Jada Pinkett, August Alsina, and Will Smith. And in regard to it, I don't necessarily have an issue with people per se having and speaking on trivial matters, but when we talk about building community and we talk about the necessary things and the discipline that goes into a lifestyle, and not necessarily canceling one person or one entity, where I see Goya is also being canceled at the same time that we're speaking, and then the CEO says, I'm doubling down on that. And as it relates to discipline, I think what we have to get into the space of doing is following through on daily regimens, and I want to hear your opinion around, or not even your opinion, but your perspective around, you know, the regimens that it takes to build a community. We both work in nonprofit, civic engagement oriented environments, which means that, you know, I on a day to day as my work, day in, day out, in terms of the job that I get paid for, also feeds into that directly. So for me, it's not as strenuous for a person who may say work a job that isn't in that industry to participate in the civic engagement duties at the same time that they're doing the economic piece in terms of sustaining the life in a calcifying America. So, how do you feel about it?
That's a mouthful.
So it is.
Give me a chance to digest.
And you could just chop it up down to the discipline and the regimens, because I think that's the bigger piece of building the community.
Yeah, but I have a big habit of taking it because I'm lazy and just compressing it into my phrasing. But what I want to start off with when we talk about this, starting from the Will and Jada perspective, I commented on my Facebook and talked about how I can take this and relate it to Middle March, which is a George Eliot novel, a Victorian novel about the Victorian household.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to Will and Jada, right now when it comes down to, because I'm getting to policy and politics and American understanding, what I'm getting to is that this Victorian lifestyle comes out of the Victorian era in England.
Mm-hmm.
And where you have this ideal of this man who goes outside of the household and his job is to make as much money as possible to take care of the household, because upper middle class women to affluent women aren't expected to work. And because they aren't expected to work, he has to generate enough income to maintain the lifestyle that she wants to maintain. This also can be said inside of Edith Wharton's House of Mirth. So what I'm getting to is that when you translate that over to black pop culture, without
Mm-hmm.
really taking over pop culture,
Mm-hmm.
you have T.I.
No, cut this way.
Oh, I got you. You have T.I. You have T.I. and Tiny, where T.I. talks about in one of his lines about he can't have excuses because no one can eat if he has any excuses.
This is true.
So when you go to the Will and Jada, Will Smith, he's this big star in the African American community or the ADOS community. There's this thing about men being present and taking care of the household. So
Mm-hmm.
Will Smith is that ideal, and he makes the money. So Jada Pinkett Smith is supposed to be the angel of the household, meaning she's supposed to just fall back, support him, take care of him. And when we play that out inside of our communities, it really does come down to, and I use it as a pejorative, and this is where I'm going to kind of kick it off to you. And when we talk about discipline, the discipline it takes to generate intergenerational wealth is lost when we start calling our family structure between baby mama and baby daddy instead of mother of my child, father of my child, because the respect is in the language. And because the respect isn't in the language, the respect isn't reflected inside of the household. And so then when we start talking about these conversations about building wealth, but again, I always say, riches is luck, wealth is character development. And so when we get down to wealthy communities and rich communities, they don't understand the policies why most people who don't consume policy, don't understand the behavioral or the de facto things that go into building the community.
And so, your question, I'm sorry, can you
No problem.
give your question to me in terms of what is it, are you saying to me, what is it that I feel about the disciplines and how people should go about it?
No, what I'm asking is, I don't see discipline reflected in the language. So if discipline is not in the language, my question to you, is discipline really in the minds of the people we're trying to reach? Because it takes a discipline to be civically engaged, and to civically engage, you gotta have a certain level of income and stability to take care of your home, to worry about other people outside of your home.
Yeah, and so I can agree somewhat to that. I just want you to come over this way so the people can see who this brilliant mind is. But in regard to your question though, I think that, we don't necessarily have discipline within the group. just based on what we see. And everybody always likes to say men lie, women lie, numbers don't. But when we talk about us in regard to the language in itself, and how we deflect a lot of responsibility, whether it be onto religion, another person, another entity, and so on. Because I fully understand that we as a group are oppressed people within a nation. But when it comes down to the level of activity that we're talking about, it comes down to it goes back to those everyday things that you're doing in regard to building the human capital that is required to have the level of wealth within the community. Because you need to be, again, we both know that one person can't do it. Everybody who's ever built any type of wealth understands that you have to have relationships, you have to have a certain level of acumen when it comes to not only your specific profession, but general knowledge. And what I mean by that is, people are well versed in, say, let's use Ben Carson for an example.
Okay.
He's a neurosurgeon, right?
Mm-hmm.
I expect him to be able to go to a certain level of detail of neuroscience or whatever he does in that specific industry to be able to articulate that. What I'm saying though is, even though he has that, there is a certain level of general knowledge that we have to understand in terms of whether it be how your local government works, because you don't have to, I'm not even saying that we have to be up to speed on every law, as most people aren't. Those are some things that you can research. But in terms of but in terms of engaging the institutions of saying, like, going to a town hall meeting that an elected official is having, or going to, like, your typical, what we have in DC is ANC meetings, civic associations, and if you don't have those, you can build those.
Okay.
You can build those. And I don't see it in a language. And I also don't see it in the outcomes. Because a lot of people will say, and we can keep it on language,
Mm-hmm.
well, if we're having a conversation around how we're supposed to be diverting our attention in terms of what it is and what it takes and what is required to build this. So we're having a conversation right now about Jada Pinkett, Will Smith, and the whole, again, we can have a constructive conversation, but the way that the conversation is being had, I don't see it, again, in the language, because it comes down to, what are your takeaways from this? Do we want to talk about how it's problematic to have these relationship goals and base those relationship goals on these abstractions in terms of them being anomalies, in the sense that that is not everyday average person's life, but we attach ourselves onto that, right? And so, again, that gets back into absolving these things onto other people.
I get what you're saying. Were you done?
Not necessarily done, but I think the point that I'm trying to make is that you can't do that and then come behind it and say, well, we can walk and chew bubblegum while at the same time the numbers aren't there to support the argument. Because I'm all for it, but the numbers aren't necessarily there to say, well, Devon, we've learned how to have these conversations and do politics at the same time, and do civic engagement at the same time, and do wealth building at the same time. Or not necessarily wealth building, but group economics at the same time. Yeah. And so, if that is not there, I think that goes back into the language in terms of us acquiescing ourselves, us moving in a space where we are trying to absolve ourselves of what we have in front of us.
I'm
Because
listening.
no, I got you, but the reality is there are a array of things going on right now that I won't jump into because it may derail the conversation in terms of, the seriousness of the situation around, the housing crisis and people being able to pay their rent and whatnot, versus how we're having that conversation about them.
I get what you're saying, but for me, my difficulty is, and I'll speak to the camera directly. My difficulty is that we don't take into consideration, when I mean we, the pop culture, the zeitgeist, doesn't like death. And what I mean by that is that we can talk about those things. When you talk relationship goals, we gotta talk about what affords Will and Jada to even have this very private moment dominate so many different people's conversations. The level of exposure they have to do that. And we see a lot of, they call it clout chasing, but it's a really old marketing trick. Is what are people interested in? Human stories.
Mm-hmm.
So the human story of right now with the takeaways is that the takeaways, why is this, what I'm hearing is, why is a successful man and successful woman allowing someone into their marriage? And especially someone as young as August Alsina, right? But we have to get into, again, when you talk about the day-to-day, like what Jordan Peterson talk about the day-to-day. It's like, it's about, when he says to Joe Rogan, it's really about who comes into your household, right? It's about who greets you at the door, because that's what you want to spend most of your time doing. And it's because the ADOS community, or the Black American community, doesn't have exposure to professional lifestyles and what it takes to build to those big moments and projects. They see and remember and talk about people longer than the project actually goes on. So what I'm getting down to is that they don't see the day-to-day interactions, those day-to-day emotional tolls that it takes from both of those partners to maintain the level of exposure, to maintain those jobs, to do the shooting that they got to do for the red table, to talk to the people they have to talk to, because they can't do the lighting, they can't do everything to make the show successful. So they don't see the back end work. And the back end work takes you away from your family. And we live, like I was saying earlier, we live second to second. We don't necessarily live minute to minute. And what that means is that when you become aware of how long you're spending on certain things, it emotionally drains you. So what I'm getting to is the relationship goals are more of a fantasy than it is a reality, because we don't have those conversations about what it actually takes to be civically engaged as well as raising a family. What it actually takes to be present and at a high level and a high profile person, raise children, keep your obligations to your contracts and your investors, keep those stories. It's like we don't have those kind of conversations because most people in our community aren't in those kind of professional environments. And those who are often mitigated or distanced away from us, because going back to your human capital thing and building wealth, we don't have a professional class that exists inside of most urban Black areas. And because those professional classes don't exist, they contribute to a brain, because we do not have Black American professionals within our communities, it contributes to a brain drain. Therefore, not enough people have access to the lifestyle that Will and Jada live, as most professionals live, in which they have to focus and practice on what it is that they are doing. So they don't see the emotional toll that is taken on Jada as well as Will. That's what I mean by the Victorian values. Because in the Victorian era, you were supposed to be devoted to one woman. It goes back to the whole thing about chivalry. And just, you devoted to this one woman. But it was not uncommon, and it was expected for the man of the household to have a mistress. It was expected for the man of the household to do whatever he wanted to do. But that's when you get to this term cockled, because this is what this really is. Will and Jada is a cockled narrative, meaning that the husband's supposed to have been cheated on by his wife, and therefore they broke his honor. And so when we talk about relationship goals, what we do have great discipline in is focusing on how a person was betrayed and deciding who's the victim and who wasn't.
And I think for me, keeping it on building community, and just make sure that see if you can come over it in a way that just undergirds kind of like that.
Gotcha.
Because I need you here with me.
Yes.
But I think what happens when we do it in that regard, and that's our takeaway, it doesn't build on any collective effort. And when we're talking about, building a community and where we're diverting our attention and how we're using our time, because time is a very fundamental concept that everybody has. And even when you talk about a profession and what goes into being a professional and how many hours, and I forget how many hours they say it takes for you
10,000.
10,000.
Malcolm Gladwell's book, yeah.
So it takes you that many amount of numbers to be considered a professional, but people feel like they can go to every happy hour, go to or watch every show.
Can I jump into?
Go ahead,
Because I want you to keep going. They can. We're doing it now. It's not about the activity. It's about the people doing the activity.
This is true.
I would love for you all to literally be in a spot. Please comment and just like, oh yeah, you got your own joint. You want to jump in? Jump in, because it's really about, when we talk about community building, people don't want to be all high and snotty. People want to sit back and chill and do what we're doing right now. But I'm sorry, I jumped in. I'm out there.
No, you good. Because what happens is, like you said, it is what we're doing, and the biggest thing is, again, people will complain about, the culture and the ills of the culture, but still go and support rap, because bringing that back into the mix, Janelle Monáe, I guess, made a comment about her wanting to remove rap and leave women rap, or female artists, and it's like, look, I'm not against rap and hip hop, but at the same time, and again, I'm not against sports or any of that, but at the same time, when you begin to devote so much attention onto one thing, you're not building the other assets and skills that are required to get to what it is you're saying you want, which is a formidable response to white supremacy. Most black people would say, what does it take to build a response to white supremacy? What I would tell a person is, it is your lifestyle. It comes down to you saying, you know what? As much as I like this person, I can't support this business, I can't support this company just because they're there, and I want to be able to play a particular game that feeds back into the destruction of us.
Yes, and that's why I do have this book right here, The Visible Hand.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and you know me, I be hopping, like, read. It's like, yo, it's a playbook being ran against you. And because you don't have that time, because time poverty is another type of poverty. And this is where...
There's a whole movie on it.
I didn't know that.
In Time, with Justin Timberlake.
Oh, okay, boom, time poverty, right? So, and this is, let's go back to the Will and Jada, because I think most people can follow us through that. Now, I'm talking about the Victorian era. I'm using Will and Jada as
King and Queen.
King and Queen on the chessboard.
Because in the end, as relative to what the black community is in terms of
economic chess.
Yes.
Economic chess.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
No, you good.
No, but the thing about it is that when you read The Visible Hand by Alfred Chandler Jr., he talks about how cotton was used to build infrastructure, like banks in Liverpool. Southern cotton, picked by Negro, built banks in England. And once you begin to understand what it means to have the sophistication of the market and the understanding that the slave had, you're not so willing to throw away their knowledge. And what I mean by that is because people aren't aware of how the social game moves. And Will and Jada are the king and queen on the economic chessboard in their business, in their structure.
Because Will and Jada is a brand.
They are a brand. They're like Kim and Kanye. They did Kim and
Like,
Kanye.
what's the dolls? Barbie and Ken?
Yeah, they're the black Barbie and Ken in the moment. Because next is going to come Lemonade, Beyonce. And
No, they all are the Barbie and Ken.
Yeah, but again, and we're from, because we are American. I think that's what ADOS has to accept. And black America has to accept, black people have to accept is that there's, within the African diaspora, there are Americans who are black. And so we do feed into a certain level of American ideology. And that goes back to the Victorian. We have to accept that with that time poverty, there's expectations that's placed on you as a Black American man, and there's expectations that's placed on me as a Black American. Let's say if I was to say a Black American woman, and this is the discussion between. Thank you, Quan the Public, for commenting. It just makes us feel love. I had to call you out for that one. But I also called you out for this one because I remember when you posted the conversation between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin in 1971, in which they're discussing why we have so much trouble in the Black family structure for Black American women and Black American men to survive. And it's the economic pressure with the ideals that's placed in front of us. Because the ideals right now, are white, and that's why so many people are really heartbroken because I feel like a lot of Black Americans live vicariously to escape our day to day.
Yes.
And living vicariously to escape our day to day, because Dr. Cornel West talks about that often, it keeps us from literally looking and talking and discussing and having these discussions amongst ourselves, which we did when we were migrating from the South. Which we did when we were on the plantation, because we had to talk to each other about what was going to happen. Because if you were seen as doing certain things, you had just been sold.
And that's why, not to cut you
No,
off,
go ahead.
that's why
Conversations is jazz.
boycotts were more effective because going back into what's required, right? And we had another show about identity politics and how coalitions fail us. Because everybody right now is going to take our energy, take our political capital as African Americans and those people, specifically those who come from slavery, right? We're going to take our political capital, energy, and story to undergird a boycott.
Black Lives Matter. That's what you're talking about.
Not even Black Lives.
That's what came to my head.
No, Black Lives Matter. Yes.
But not them exactly.
Not them exactly. But in terms of this whole Goya boycott because of him showing support for Trump, I get it. I understand it. But at the same time, we have never had that level of transaction. And so part of going back to, again, community building is that you have to have that basic general knowledge. Then you also have to interact with these things because we end up giving so much of ourselves to other groups to help them get wins, right? When we also are in our communities as a separate coalition, but like you said, in keeping it on not like talking to each other and whatnot, that's where we are not a coalition. That's where we are not a monolith. Because we're not having those conversations anymore, like you said, due to people being overly aspirational to some extent, if you juxtapose it to where we're coming from, and like you said, what we have in them having that access to the level of wealth that they do. And so we have these very idealistic goals and wanting to access whiteness, because that's why you have the whole concept of crossing over, because that economic floor the economic ceiling of African Americans, because we've been generationally held down economically.
And excluded.
Yeah, and excluded. We don't have that. So you have to make that jump over into those ideals, and that also compromises your behavior, which also feeds back into us not being able to build a community. Because our community, like you said, us being American, is so interwoven with Americanness and whiteness and racism itself. People always wonder, like, how do so many black people perpetuate the ideals of racism? It's because we identify as black. Black and white is that. You're identifying as a race. From the concrete, you're participating in it based on what you're identifying as, right? And so what we have to do is kind of sit down and figure out, which is also work, but people don't feel like it's work because your body isn't moving, because we judge a lot of, moving around, being in different spaces. We think that is what the politics is. It's like, no, right now it would be more beneficial for us to sit down, have these conversations about how we fit into this puzzle piece of a highly, highly, highly diverse America right now. Because this isn't, people want to use, idols like King and X and all of those people like even Angela Davis, because when we talk about that, it's like, look, do we want to put energy behind prison abolition? I agree with the concept in terms of it being within a scholarly class environment, academic environment, but at the same time, when you put it into the playing field of what we're doing and what we have in terms of a highly corrupt political system, corporate not necessarily being not necessarily being beneficial, or I would say in trying to mitigate. So you have two parties working in cohesion with that. And so we have to figure out a way to not overexert ourselves on things that are not a priority. And I get people wanting to feel the desire to work in all of these other different groups, but at the same time, that time, going back to that time poverty, we also are poor in that sense because again, we live in poverty, so it takes us that many more steps to do one thing. So we have to be that means that you have to be more diligent about what it is you're giving your money to, attention to, and all those other things.
Yes, and that comes in with being a sophisticated consumer. And when I mean sophisticated, I don't mean educated and speaking like this and being all hot. No, I mean just knowing what's going on. Buyer beware. Is understanding that when you buy into an idea, you also commit your time to the idea. And because in my experience, and I always bring that wealth is character development because I had the Voya and everything else is that when you become politically astute or politically aware, you do pay attention to what Jordan Peterson was talking about with the mundane and how much time you're spending. Because you understand, and what Joe Rogan was talking about with the discipline, you really begin to understand what you're focusing your mental energy on, not just your physical energy. And in the community, when I mean the community, I mean the Black American community, the ADOS community, we can even spread it to the diaspora, because some people do spread it to the diaspora. It's a lot of conversation about white supremacy. And I think the focus on what white supremacy has done and the brutality it has done to the bodies of black bodies often dominates the conversation instead of understanding how they were able to get away with the brutality. Why is to understand it just because something is legal doesn't mean it's just. Like slavery was legal until it wasn't. Lynching was legal until it wasn't. Why? Because it was
collecting your phone data is
legal. Why? Because it's a cultural practice. And the only way you stop something from being a cultural practice is that you become aware of it. And you become aware of how you are participating in the cultural practice that feeds into a feedback loop that is your demise. Basically, environmentalism, because let's take it away, because people, to a certain degree, and this is very true with the Black American community, we get so much scrutiny from the outside that when we get together, when we have critical conversations together, that scrutiny can also feel like you're judging me because you're telling a truth about me. And it's a way that I go through the world and it feels like there's pain there. But it's like more so I'm moving the thorns that are in your back, the hooks that America put in you to make you think it is your job to go and pay for a white person's dream. Because that's how they make money, selling you a dream that you can never really afford. And what I mean by white, I mean institutional, not necessarily a person. So what I'm getting back to when we talk about community building in the day-to-day, once you become politically aware, you become aware that a politician is also a person. And that cooperation has to happen at a certain level. So we are cooperating. There is cooperation going on, getting back to the corruption and crony capitalism. There's cooperation going on, but at what level and with who? And that's why I get so frustrated when someone says that's my baby mama or that's my baby daddy. It's that distancing language. It's that only way I'm tied to this person is through my child. It's like, what you don't understand is that when you laid down and had your child with that person, or when you made the child with that person, go back to Tupac and Brenda has a baby, you have to understand you also made an economic commitment because children are expensive. And the state has a commitment or a stated commitment. A stated commitment, that is crazy. A stated commitment to raising people because we were at a point in the 19th century where we had orphanages and we can't afford it. So the state is now like, we're interested in the well-being of the child, right? And so the TANF and WIC and all that other stuff, if she goes for the TANF and WIC, now the state is looking for you because they want to look for who's going to pay them back. So when we start talk about the economic things, it's like why Will and Jada to me is such a the conversation is such a distraction from what really needs to be discussed is that they don't have these problems. They don't have to worry about these things. This is just an emotional hiccup. But when you are a person who can't afford a divorce, because after 50, the two things that bankrupt you are divorces and health. And when you have in a community, oh, I can't deal with her because of this, that, and the third. I can't deal with him, this, that, and the third, because you hold in your minds, you're viewing each other through this ideal and this prism of whiteness, instead of saying, like, I know they fuck you over every day. I know they do you wrong. Tell me how they do you wrong. Because we got the information in us, we're just not willing to listen to each other. Because you can also tell, oh, thank you, I'm sorry. But it's like, we can also tell, like, I'll break it down, right? Let's take my little situation today that we talk about all cameras. Lightweight machine gun is used to deal with dudes who aren't ambitious. Used to dudes who are willing to fake a life. They got the Gucci belt, not understanding that $300 worth of Gucci belt is nothing to anybody who understands Curing Group, who understands money. You just bought from a conglomerate $300 to show status, right? Once you build a name, you don't need status. Your status is your name. Yeah. So in the Black American community, we don't spend enough time building each other up so that our names are our status. We can have our battles back and forth. We can say what we want to in a household. It's not for social media. She may piss you off because she told you the truth about you and you don't like it. Instead of going to Facebook, go in a closet and scream. Get angry. Drink a beer in your house and cry. Don't invite the state into your situation. Because the state doesn't give a shit about black families. No. It never has and it never will.
It's been mechanized to do the damage that it's done.
Are they boycotting Gucci for real? I love that you commented that, but are they really boycotting Gucci?
They're not really boycotting Gucci. Because in the end, what happens is, and you always hear me talk about, the work that has to be done right now is everybody has to get honest and we all have to come to the consensus of what it is we are going to do and what it is the rules of engagement, because we have to form internal policy. No, you good. We have to form internal policy to be able to move external policy, because if we don't have an internal policy, which is rules of engagement, which is you can't do this, you can't do that, if you do that, we're going to shun you, here are the consequences, here we are laying out how we want our group to look, right? But people don't want to do that because we've been taught that discourse is bad. You don't want to be disagreeable. And part of the problem is we don't have enough people, because they want to play the game and because they want these white ideals and because they don't understand that when you talk about African Americans, though we aren't monolithic in terms of our cultural desires and aspects and perspectives, we are monolithic when it comes to how our economic position is juxtaposed to white America.
Yeah. So,
with that being said, we have to get into building, like you said, people up because that is the social capital. And that comes from having some of these discussions in the open.
Mm-hmm.
I've debated a lot of people behind closed doors because people disagree with my opinions, whether it be friends, whether it be colleagues or peers. But at the same time, when it comes down to us having these discussions in the open, I feel like because even our elected officials do it, they like to preserve. Because again, you don't have to bash a person, but we have to develop our intellectual capital. Because what's happening is, you mentioned Cornell West, and we have this pocket of what I feel are the last of a dying breed in terms of true intellectuals. And what I mean by true intellectuals are those who are objective enough, because what we have right now is we have this polarized situation where both parties are going to pick and choose. Because it's crazy, going back to the cancel culture and us giving our energy to that. We're canceling everybody, but at the same time, we're about to vote for Joe Biden, is a person who should be canceled. But because we don't have that objective lens of who we're canceling based on what, because again, we don't have the internal policy within our own group, we really don't have a mechanism to say, no, that is wrong, we're not going to support you, not because it is the trending thing to do, because intent matters. Intent matters immensely, more than anything else. Because we can be both in a race to get $1,000, but why we want that $1,000 is more pivotal. When it comes to community building, because I want to reorient, when it comes to community building, we have to understand that if we aren't...
We got a thing about the blackout day. Was it effective?
No.
I was about to say it was not effective at all.
When you talk about, when you have a situation like the blackout day, and we addressed that too also in our July 4th video, because it's a similar tactic. What happens is, again, when you don't necessarily have the consensus of the people, you don't necessarily have a large enough footprint to really gut the wealth that you're trying to do. And two, on top of that, you don't have the level of consistency. Because a lot of what people do is they conflate things. And when you are talking about politics, political strategy, and it has to be politics because you live in America, which all of our industries are attached to politics. Mm-hmm. So whether you want to or not, it is politicized to some degree, some more than others, depending on what the political advantage is.
Yeah, but when you talk about politics and going back to the day-to-day and the discipline, it also means you're willing to accept certain limitations.
Yes.
And when you say politics, politics is a huge term because it also takes in history of businesses, history of all things that makes a society go. So in answering your question directly, Kwan, no, it was not effective, and for many of the reasons you said. But what I want to reiterate is that it wasn't effective. Going back to the consensus portion is because people will refer to SCLC, SNCC, and all these organizations in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. They don't understand how long the bus boycott lasted. It was over a year. And then people didn't agree. People were getting upset within the Black American community. And so they had to pull their resources together to make sure that the economic pressure that was on the bus company was so heavy that they were forced to change. And so when you, the blackout, and you talk about the blackout is not effective because the blackout doesn't take into consideration the lives. And that's why the lives that we live day to day. Because when a white America, because the blackout, and I'll make it succinct in this point, the blackout was using white liberalism as a way for black liberation, and tone policing and saying we're going to make this symbolic gesture about what's the police brutality that's happening. But what really needs to happen with Black American life is that our day-to-day life needs to be shown. The humanity needs to be shown. And it really does start talking about when Black American women go to the hospital and they're not treated because they don't believe that they're actually in pain. And how those institutional biases and mistrust plays out in our households, because when we go out into the world treats us very rough.
Mm-hmm.
It's like our emotions don't matter.
They don't.
And so when we get into our intimate families, that callousness that we develop toward the world can easily develop towards one another, intentionally or unintentionally. It develops. So that's when you don't necessarily have the conversations that we need to have. You don't have the opportunities that we need to have when we talk about from the Black American mother to getting treated poorly at the hospital to the Black American father not necessarily being able to leverage anything that he does to get his wife, partner, however you want to describe it, better care. And if we extend beyond that. But another thing about the Black Hour is that we need to show our lives as they are, not as we wish them to be.
Yes.
Because if we show our lives as they are and not as we wish them to be.
You know what we should do? We should, I got an idea for a series in terms of, and it fitting in with Death of a Nigga Boy, because you know, that is all about the pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why you got the tear. And in terms of, like you said, who's having a conversation and how we're having a conversation. So we'll go over some things in terms of getting people and directing that conversation a little bit different. Because again, it's not even being against the affluent in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
My particular issue with the affluent in terms of when it comes down to the community building, and what I feel like the disconnect is in there is that you aren't really telling people how you had to navigate the pains, the ups and the downs. Because keeping it on the Will and Jada, what it is, what I will or what I can say is a good takeaway from it is the fact that it shows you the ups and downs, which is why I said that I wish it could be a staple or the indication of, or us pivoting to, we can't do relationship goals. Because even Will and Jada, the biggest brand ever, J. Cole even made a rap about the relationship dynamic. Let's take that. I forget the song, but he rapped about it in terms of I want to have that Will and Jada love.
I got you.
You know, and I get it, I understand it, but let's have a conversation around: do we want to do that? Let's let Will Smith and Jada have their own private relation. Let's also encourage August Alsina to go get some help and keep also that private, because what we can't have, I get that they have issues and that they are the example, but let's help them help us. We don't need to have this conversation. Let Will and Jada have that conversation.
I agree.
I don't really necessarily care about their relationship in that way, but I understand that things go on. And let's also, in our own specific relationships, have a conversation about, you know what, boo? Do we really want to pattern our life after this when we don't even, like you said, have the resources and have the access that provides them the ability to be able to even do that?
Oh, we got somebody that says therapy need to be normalized, and I agree. I definitely agree when it says therapy need to be normalized, and that's what I would say you're speaking
I
to.
agree.
Because this is a very private moment that they're having. And this private moment is being used for commercial reasons.
And that's toxic.
It is, because that's what feeds
Toxic capitalism.
That's what feeds the black news cycle.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about scandal. Yes, we really do, and I'm one of the main persons that's pushing for it, because my frame of reference is therapy. So the warrior poetess said we need to destigmatize, therapy in our community.
I agree.
And I agree.
I need therapy.
And that's why I definitely need therapy.
My girlfriend recommended me therapy.
We need the shit, and Black American boys need the shit. And why we need the shit is because we go through some things that we don't talk about. And whenever we try to talk about them, we get so amped that it takes another black American man to understand it's like, he mad because he's been through something. He's held on for so long.
Not even he mad.
But it's feeling. Exactly. But it's anger. It's disgust. It's hurt. It's pain. All because at the time it happened to you, you had no one else around you to say, hold the fuck on. You're not going to treat my youngin' like that. That's what is missing when they say the father figure is that there's nobody that's willing to say, I'm old enough to take this blow. I'm calling enough to face the world. You want to attack my child? I got something for you. I ain't even got to use my hands. How about we talk about the divorce rate inside of white America, but let's also talk about how we don't talk about the corporate debt right now that white America has, and they run on credit. And we don't have the same access to credit. We don't have the same access to loans. Black American women, yes, they are in professional roles. However, those professional roles tend to be at the lower side of the ladder. So when they're inside of these roles, they have more money than black American men on average, but they don't have more power. So when you are a black American woman who is able to
have this.
I'm sorry, I don't know the name, the shout out, but thank you for shouting people out. We need more people.
Ayanna Presley. Yeah, because Ayanna is definitely, I would say, a real person. And even in my time, not to cut you off.
No, good. I think I know who you're talking about now. She be having glasses and she be going.
Yeah,
going.
Even my time in the mayor's office, and doing community work, what I can say is, though we disagree sometimes on different things, what I can appreciate about her is she is willing to not only listen, but hold her stance, not because it's trend, but just because. Yeah. And, in a lot of cases, again, and we can go and keep this back into, again, the community building, because I like that reorientation. Because we need to begin to embrace more people who you may not necessarily like, or you may not necessarily think has the best etiquette, because keeping it back to how necessarily white people move in terms of this passive aggressive nature that we have in terms of keeping it on DC politics. People do a lot of violence, and even when you talk about politics, a lot of violence in that, but just not necessarily, like you said, emoted in the way that we're used to, and having and having that level of discernment. But you have to begin to shift that cultural dynamic. You have to allow those people into the conversation, because they are, in some cases, the pivot. Because we talk a lot about, or we have a lot
I just want to state one thing.
Go ahead.
That means that when white culture or white people are calling black women out as a black angry woman, a black American man has to step up and say, no, she's not angry for no reason.
And vice versa.
Exactly. They're not angry for no reason. She's not angry for no reason.
Let her talk.
Exactly. Let her preach. Let her have her space. Let her have her moment. Because right now she knows I got the attention. Let me use it while I got the attention. And it's been part of the tradition. Children of Truth, Shirley Chisholm, Maxine Waters. It's like it's a whole tradition. 1968, Tony and Concave, Black Woman, the anthology. No, but what I'm trying to get to is that, bro, they keep us from each other emotionally. We physically in the same space, but we're emotionally apart. And when I was talking about with lightweight machine gun, when we was talking about the discipline and everything else, you don't know the discipline of saying, I'm going to touch you and let you know, even though I'm not near you, I'm thinking about you. We do that in this community when we want to get something from somebody.
Yeah.
But we don't do that when it's just like, hey, I know you've been having a struggle at work the other day, so I went ahead and took a little bit of extra disposable cash I had and bought this for you. Nah, I don't need nothing for you. You don't have to spread your legs and nothing else. I just want to make sure that you're okay. We don't do that. Or those who do that, we sit. Or we not manly enough. And it's just like, you don't know what it really takes.
And that's because, again, the whole definition of manhood, which I would say has been also dissolved by black women, right? And I say that because a lot of times, especially when you talk about black mothers, and again, it's not out of bad, it's not out of malice. My mother and certain women who've been around me will be like, nah, man, man, don't do that. Like when I say fuck Joe Biden, I punch him in his gut. Because again, as a black man, I know what he did to us systemically in terms of transitioning mass incarceration, because I hate that technical argument that people make, like, no, he didn't. If anybody transitioned it into the modern economy. So when I say, I don't necessarily care for him, I also need black women to be like, nah, let that man speak his piece, because in the end, no, I am supposed to protect you, and the reason that I can't protect you economically or physically is because I have this other man dominating. So going back to Ayanna, what has to happen is people have to literally say, no, you deserve to get got, and keeping it on, matter of fact, keeping it on a cancel culture point, like, look, y'all want to be with everybody else in terms of canceling with all these other groups. How about we start canceling people based on an African American standard? Because a lot more people will go.
You know who's for that movement though? Monique.
I agree.
Monique was for the movement.
They
have, and that's when Monique came out and said, and that's why I'm saying, when I say Black American women, I'm not saying individual. I mean the culture of and the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to how Cornel West always talk about the tradition. We have our traditions in Black America. We have our traditions that need to be respected, not only by those outside, but us ourselves. And when you begin to respect those traditions, you begin to know what role you're supposed to play and you're not supposed to play. You begin to know when you interject and you don't interject. When Monique jumped in and called out Steve Harvey, called out who she called Leonard, Charlemagne the God, who talks about black privilege, and we know there's no such thing as black privilege, there's only tokenism. When we call out these things and how the people use these lifestyles to monetize themselves and their exposure and say, well, look at me, I am the Booker T. Washington of today, and if these Negroes act alike and they get things done, then you can lower down your pail of water and give these Negroes just a little bit of scratch.
To cut you off.
No
If
problem.
this jump cut off, we in the zone. We gonna reach back up. So don't
you.
even worry about it, people. Cause
I'm
we
getting
in
another
the
beer.
in between time, and I'll just talk to people. But
yeah.
But no.
My whole point is that you gotta get out your ego. And everyone wants to, submission. Submit to your ego. Because when you submit your ego to the goal, you begin to see where you can go, how far you're willing to go, what you contribute and what you're not willing to contribute. And when we have those open, honest conversations, now people are in their lanes. Because that's one of the things I see in Black America too. Everybody in everybody lane. Everybody lane.
Ooh,
it's like, move. Yeah, go ahead. Everybody in everybody lane.
Community building. Everybody has to be a puzzle piece, right? So what do I mean by that?